result of soul searching in the Curtis Park neighborhood that goes back at least to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May. And I should probably interrupt myself right now to introduce myself. I'm Dennis Cusick. I'm the editor of the Curtis Park newspaper, Viewpoint. After the killing of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter signs, messages, posters quickly went up in the neighborhood. And that led to questions. Who are we as a neighborhood? How did we get here? What do we want to be? SCNA, the Neighborhood Association, produced a statement for the July issue of Viewpoint that called for continued discussion and the search for new and better solutions for existing inequity and injustice. Tonight's meeting is sponsored by SCNA and its ad hoc committee on racial justice in collaboration with the Renaissance Society. Tonight is an attempt to further the discussion by talking about the history of racial segregation that is the legacy of the neighborhood and the city as a whole. At the end of the presentations, we will have time for questions that you send to me via Zoom's chat function. Any technical questions about Zoom should be sent to the attention of Mary Ellen. At the end of the presentations, we'll have, as Mary Ellen said, breakout sessions in which you can tell your stories, express your opinions, or if it's more comfortable, you can just listen. That part of the presentation will not be recorded. Tonight, I'm joined by two longtime neighborhood residents. Ginger Rutland is a retired journalist and recently a playwright whose play, When We Were Colored, was performed at the Sacramento Theater Company last year and at the Guild Theater early this year. Ginger was an editorial writer for the Sacramento Bee for 25 years, a commentator on Capital Public Radio, and earlier in her career, a reporter for KCRA TV in Sacramento and KRON TV in San Francisco. Our other presenter is Dan Murphy. He's the author of the definitive neighborhood history, Sacramento's Curtis Park, which is available online from Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and you'll see an ad in the October issue of Viewpoint for some local bookstores that also carry it. Dan is a retired lawyer who worked for the California Rural Legal Assistance and the 3rd District Court of Appeal. I'd like to start with Ginger, for whom this story is personal. When her father came to Sacramento in 1952 for a job at McClellan Air Force Base, he discovered that it was difficult for a Black man to find a neighborhood where he could buy a house. The family ended up in the Highland Park area of Curtis Park, north of 2nd Avenue and east of DMV. Ginger and her siblings attended Sierra Elementary School. Ginger, I'd like you to tell your story, please.
Thanks, Dennis, and thank you all for being here. As Dennis has said, my family moved to Sacramento from Ohio in 1952. My father, he came first. He drove across the country in the family's old Dodge DeSoto. It was probably a 1949 car with our dog, a black Cocker Spaniel named Spanky. He was coming to take a new job at McClellan Air Force Base. The Cold War was heating up and military bases were expanding all across the country. McClellan was one, particularly Air Force bases. Dad had begun his career during World War II at the segregated Tuskegee Army Air Force Base. That was where Uncle Sam trained Black pilots for the first time. Now, my father was a civilian. My mother had two cousins who were in fact pilots. Both of them saw combat in Europe and both were killed during the war. After the war, President Truman integrated the armed services and public service and civil service. Dad was able to keep his good government job. He was transferred first to Ohio, where I was born, my twin sister, my brother, and then he came to McClellan Air Force Base. He drove out to find a house. As my mother wrote in her memoir, new houses were being built all across the city, but particularly near the Air Force Base for this burgeoning personnel who were arriving there in big numbers. They were better than average track homes, my mother recalled, with built-in everything and an executive air, but Black folks could not buy. The housing was strictly segregated. So my father went out with a Black real estate agent, and that real estate agent took him all over neighborhoods where Blacks could buy, poor neighborhoods with shack after shack after shack my father saw, and he wasn't happy. So one day he went out on his own. He was driving around and he came to 27th Street between Broadway and 2nd Avenue. And he saw, as he called them, Orientals playing in a yard across the street from a house that had a for sale sign on it. And he figured, well, if they sell to Orientals, they'll sell to Blacks. And in fact, they did, or as he said at that time, coloreds. I think I'll show you a picture of our family at that period. This is probably our first picture taken in our home in Sacramento, California. We call it sort of the toothpaste ad picture. Any rate, it was 1952. My father was we were kind of a father knows best kind of family. My mother, my father, my brother Billy, my twin sister and I, Patty, Joe, and Ginger, and my older sister Elsie. There were four of us. It was about, which seems like a large family today, but was about average at that time. When my father was unable to buy in other neighborhoods, he bought this house on 27th Street. But oddly enough, the Black real estate agent who had been taking him around for weeks was not able to broker the deal. They had to bring in a white real estate agent, even in this mixed neighborhood, to broker the deal. So it wasn't just that Black families were cut out of neighborhoods. Real estate professionals who were Black were also unable to negotiate for sales in even mixed neighborhoods. Let's see, in this picture, I'm 4 years old, my brother's 5, my sister Elsie is 8. We went to Sierra School. It was a predominantly white school, but there were a smattering of Blacks and Asians as well. You know, what's odd, I don't remember any Hispanics at the school, which I find, even today, I can't imagine that. But in 1952, I don't remember that many Hispanics in Sacramento where I went to school. Not soon after this, my parents began looking for a nicer home in a better neighborhood in the suburbs. They were repeatedly rebuffed. Let's show a different picture, just because I want to show you what family life was like in Sacramento. This is a picture, Mary Ellen, can you put in the other picture? We have one more. There. This is all of us in the backyard with our dog Spanky, my brother, my sister, and I. And that guy there is Gus Kaplanis, who grew up to do, I think he ran a small newspaper in Sacramento, but he was our good friend. We played with everybody, whites, Blacks, Asians. It was a very, very happy, a very Leave It to Beaver kind of childhood. But as I said, my parents really wanted to move into a nicer house in a better neighborhood. But every time they tried to move or they tried to buy a home, they were rebuffed because they were Black. Then my mother, one day my father was out of town. He was out of town a lot. It was the Cold War, and he was selling weapons of mass destruction to our allies all over the world. And anyway, he was out of town. And my mother found a lot in Southland Park Hills that we could afford. And she went to one of my father's colleagues. His name was Herb Madeira. She said, Herb, I found a lot. They won't sell it to me. Will you buy it for us? Herb Madeira said, sure, Eva, I'd be happy to. So he bought the lot, sold it immediately to my parents, and we built our house in the suburbs and sort of punched our ticket into the middle class. And we lived there. My parents lived there until they died. Now it's 1985, and I come back to Curtis Park. I finished college. I'm married. My husband and I have our first child, and we come back to Curtis Park. We looked all over Sacramento. We looked at Land Park. We looked at Curtis Park. We looked at McKinley Park. Those were the kinds of neighborhoods we wanted. We chose Curtis Park because it had the right kind of vibe for us. McKinley Park was a little too white in my view and a little too conservative. Land Park, we probably couldn't afford. Anyway, we came to Curtis Park and we were very happy. So we bought a home first on Highland Avenue, and then we bought a home on Donner Way where I live now. And at that time, of course, 85, we had no difficulty whatever buying a house. It was a big difference from what it was in 1952 when my parents arrived. That's our story. Thank you. I think you're muted, Dennis.
I can jump right in if that works, Dennis.
You're muted, Dennis.
So I'm going to start with my presentation because Dennis has already introduced me. My name again is Dan Murphy. I don't need my first slide yet. I did want to say at the outset that if you do buy the Curtis Park book that's going to be advertised in the Viewpoint, I don't get any of the proceeds. It all goes to the Sierra Curtis Neighborhood Association. And at the beginning, I wanted to talk just very briefly, and maybe it's a good topic for the breakout rooms, about why home ownership is such an important topic for us and why we're targeting that as our first seminar. Home ownership is central to wealth and middle class status in the American system. This is because of tax advantages provided by state and local government that make it appreciate faster and make it taxed less than anything else, to my knowledge. The best available housing stock appreciates most rapidly. If you are barred from the best available housing stock, you cannot participate in this wealth building institution. And the wealth gives you the ability to surmount economic problems, legal problems, medical problems, and to support your children or grandchildren with access to education. And your housing also gives you access to the best schools. The best neighborhoods have the best schools, so you don't get that. And instead what you get is the stigma that you are an unsuitable neighbor for the majority class in the country. So I just leave you to think about that, what it means not to have as a family and an extended family access to that kind of wealth, and what happens along the way as a family when you cannot deal with a legal problem like someone getting arrested, a medical problem, or any of these other issues. Having said that, I want to move to the historical side, and to begin that by noting that white supremacy was pervasive in America, and it was unapologetic. And in that regard, I'm going to read you a quote. There is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. And this is a quote from Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. And I don't use this quote to denigrate Abraham Lincoln, one of and perhaps the best president we've ever had, but simply to show how pervasive the notions of racial superiority have been ever since the beginning. I also raise it because I want to make the point, and I think that's part of what we're doing here tonight by focusing on the local history of segregation, that the problem of racism and segregation in America is not a problem of the South. It's a problem that has been throughout the entire country. Everywhere we've had black and white people living together, we've had racism, and now we'll turn to racism in housing in Curtis Park specifically, but you can take what I say generally as applicable to most of the outlying suburbs of the city of Sacramento. Segregation originally, I don't want the seconds. Okay, that's good. So segregation originally in housing did not have to be enforced with legal restrictions. There was enough coherence and solidarity among the people living in white neighborhoods to where there was no necessity to enforce it with legal restrictions. Intimidation and disapproval and the threat of consequences from the neighbors themselves was sufficient. And so there was no need for race restrictions in pre-World War I. So as you can see from slide 2, slide 1, which went through briefly, is an article from, there it is, from 1913. And the gist of it is that there was a complaint made to the Oak Park Businessmen's Association, which was the dominant authority in the suburbs at the time, that Hindus and Greeks were being hired at the rail yard project at the rail yards that are in Curtis Park. And this complaint was tendered as an outrage, and within a day, the supervisor of construction at the rail yards replied that this just simply was not true, and he emphatically denied that he's causing the discharge of local people and filling their places with Hindus and Greeks. If you read the early newspapers, as I have when doing the history of Curtis Park, you will find that race is frequently mentioned and in what we would call politically incorrect terms throughout. There are articles and editorials, many of them directed at the Japanese community, long before World War I was on anyone's mind, excoriating them, claiming they're traitors, reinforcing the color line in the United States. So could we have slide 2? Slide 3. Go back one, please. No, there should be one in the middle, slide 2. Anyway, slide 2, and yeah, there we go, is about what happened when a Japanese family tried to move into Highland Park in 1921. And essentially what happened is that the community was outraged. They pitched a fit, and they got the influential movers and shakers locally, the district attorney and a state senator who was a former city council person for the city, to threaten to file a lawsuit and take over the property, escheat it to the state. Totally bogus possibility, but nonetheless an expression of the outrage and the intimidation factor. And within a week, the family had to give up their title to the house and move out of town. So this is what maintains the all-white character of our subdivisions before World War I. And this what happens in each world war is, and as a result of that, minority people, and particularly blacks, are given economic opportunities and mobility that they haven't had before. And this threatens the status quo. And the response of this is that when subdivisions are developed following World War II in the 20s, when our classical revival style subdivisions that are hallmarks of architectural beauty in Curtis Park, when those are built, those subdivisions begin to use legal restrictions to enforce the color line. And this is noted, the inception of this is noted by Jesus Hernandez of UC Davis, a lecturer, in an article called Redlining Revisited. And I give you the site for it because you can Google that. It's a very interesting article about how redlining worked in Sacramento as a whole. And Mr. Hernandez says, Dr. Hernandez says, racially restrictive covenants in Sacramento took root in the 1920s when local developer J.C. Carley subdivided farmland for residential development just south of the original township. Carley, one of the founding fathers of the local real estate board, followed the National Association of Real Estate Board standards that they mandated racial covenants, restrictive covenants, and provided draft covenants. And county records show that this began a trend of racial segregation. Carley was our paramount developer in Curtis Park. He put in the big subdivisions east of Curtis Park itself. And he also became, because of his influence as a mover and shaker in the real estate community, a pattern that compelled all the other developers of subdivisions in this period to also do the same thing. And that was to put in covenants in the deed, restrictions in the deed. We could have the next slide, please. Next one after that, please. So among the other 20 subdivisions was Heilbronn Oaks, which is directly to the east of Sierra School. And this is a deed issued for one lot in the Heilbronn Oaks subdivision. And right at the beginning, when you go in and get your deed, it says, no Negro, Japanese, or Chinese, or any person of African or Mongolian descent shall own or occupy any part of said premises. And similar restrictions are contained in the deeds for all of the other Curtis Park's 1920s subdivision. We have the next slide, please. Not only were there provisions like this in the deeds, but almost every ad for the subdivisions contained either the keyword restrictions or restriction or restricted, often referring explicitly that among these were race restrictions. Next slide, please. And here's another Carley subdivision, big subdivision in Northland Park, just across Freeport Boulevard from us. And it lists the features of homeland subdivision are reasonable restrictions that safeguard homeland. And among these are strict race restrictions that guard you against unpleasant neighbors. So this is the mechanism that was put into place after World War I because of the increased possibility that Black people and other minorities might want to move into these all-white enclaves. Next slide, please. The Second World War had a similar effect. Ginger's family among them, a lot of Blacks and a lot of other minorities got increased social and economic mobility and geographic mobility, and this presented even a further threat. Now, you remember I told you that the earlier subdivisions before World War I, which include our bungalow subdivisions, didn't need covenants in them. So the way this perceived threat was responded to, you didn't have a covenant in your deed that would be enforceable to prevent this horror from occurring. So people in the neighborhoods got together and walked around mutual covenants. And what that amounted to was everyone or almost everyone in the neighborhood signed up to have their house governed by a racial restriction, which included the usual cannot be occupied or used by any person of Hindu, African, Japanese, Chinese, or Mongolian descent. Next slide, please. This is a list of the people who've signed on. This is the first page of a many-page list of the people who signed on lot by lot to get their lot and their house covered by a restrictive racial covenant. And this is occurring in 1944, and it sets the tone. Next slide, please. You'll see in this slide, this is the heart of Curtis Park. Curtis Park neighborhood now is a rough trapezoid. Northernmost part is Highland Park. That was developed in 1884. There weren't any race restrictions, but all of the major subdivisions in the heart of Curtis Park are either covered by subdivision restrictions in the deeds in the 1920s or by mutual covenants, which cover the bungalow subdivisions. And this established effectively this de facto and de jure at the time, meaning enforceable by law, color line right along 2nd Avenue in the north part of Curtis Park. Then we have the next slide, please. So I'll show you what the graduates from 1928, which is at the end of the 20s subdivision outbuilding. And there's only one, and I don't make that kind of judgment because you can't do it off the picture, but only one, what looks like to me, possible minority child in the class. We have the next slide, please. Now this is Sierra School kindergarten from the early 1950s. And in the era when Ginger was talking about her family moving in. And you'll see that maybe as many as a third of the children look like they're from minority ethnic groups. So that's the change that occurs over time. Slowly, people who are living in Highland Park, which is in the Sierra School catchment district, can start sending their children to a school south, which is in the all-white area, but you still can't move in there very easily. The history of these covenants is thwarted or changed in 1948 when a Supreme Court case called Shelley versus Kramer occurs. And in Shelley versus Kramer, the United States Supreme Court said, well, individuals are not governed by the Equal Protection Clause. They can discriminate. But when you go and use a court, you're involving the government in your discrimination, and you can't do that. It's barred by the Equal Protection Clause. And so that put a stop, for a time anyway, to restrictive covenants being the basis of being able to go to court to stop someone from moving into an all-white neighborhood. The California Real Estate Association reacted to Shelley with an unsuccessful effort to amend the Constitution to wipe it out. Their argument was as follows. The threat of occupancy by Negroes of property in white areas depreciates the value of all home properties and is a threat and a deterrent to investment in the construction or acquisition of homes of superior quality, whether large or small. Experience has been uniform that wherever and whenever Negroes have occupied homes in such areas, this has not only depreciated the values of the properties they own, but has depreciated the values of all surrounding properties. So as you can see, kind of unabashed, continuing, even at this late date, white supremacist view. After Shelley, you couldn't enforce your white restrictions by going to court. However, you could still have restrictions that would occur as a result of redlining and as a result of steering policies by real estate agencies. And the way that redlining worked very briefly is that the federal government guaranteed, as it still does today, the bulk of the loans. So when someone got a loan for their house, they would get it under the assurance that it would be backed by the federal government. Drop the loan rates, drop the interest rates. Unfortunately, the federal government used appraisal patterns that considered the effect of minority people living in the neighborhood on the creditworthiness or risk-worthiness of the loan. And they drew maps that continued to use this criterion as a characteristic of where to loan money. So money was not available to lend in areas that had minority people living in them. And this had direct effects in reinforcing the color lines in the mostly white or all white neighborhoods, and indirect effects in lowering the amount of capital that people could use to improve or to buy houses in neighborhoods that were not all white. Things look good when versus credit, and unfortunately, thereafter, the civil rights movement progresses. I don't say that the civil rights movement progressing is unfortunate, but what happens, unfortunately, the California legislature enacts the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which affirmatively outlaws discrimination by anyone, not just realtors, but by sellers themselves. And the response is that the California Real Estate Association adopts or proposes Proposition 14 to overturn the Rumford Act. And they succeed. And to show you again the temper of the times or the political mood, Proposition 14 was passed with 65% of the votes statewide and 62% in Sacramento County. And it's a few years after, but in 1966, the California Supreme Court overturns the proposition on the grounds that it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the federal Constitution. And ultimately, this is upheld by the United States Supreme Court and tolls the death knell for legal restrictions. There still continue to be and have continued to be sub rosa, under the table restrictions on people moving in of minority background into all white or mostly white neighborhoods. Whether that is a legacy of the pre-existing patterns of segregation or the appraisal evaluation system that relied upon that pre-existing system, resistance to integration by individuals, or the continuing social impediments to economic equality that have resulted in lower incomes for Blacks and for some other minority groups. In any event, we have continued to have substantially segregated housing communities, and that includes Curtis Park as one of the whitest neighborhoods in Sacramento with a 70% white population base. So that's the history of segregation, racial segregation in Sacramento. And with that, I'll thank you and end my presentation.
Thank you, Dan. And I trust everybody can hear me now. I apologize for the technical difficulty earlier. And I want to make one other correction. Dan mentioned, as I had, that the advertisement in which I said his book is available in local bookstores. It is true it's available in local bookstores, but I was confused and conflating what that ad says. The ad is actually for Eva Rutland's books, which are available at the bookstore next to the Guild Theater and other places, I believe Avid Reader also. Anyway, that ad for two of Eva Rutland's books is in the October issue of Viewpoint, which will be out in a few days. I do want to encourage people to send questions by chat if you have them. It looks like I have one from Bruce, and I'll ask Dan right now. After the U.S. Supreme Court upholds the knockdown of Prop 14 in California, what does Dan think is the primary reason for neighborhoods like ours being mostly white? And Dan, you seem to be muted.
One thing is that there was a price barrier that was legacy or a vestige of the early system, because minority people and Black people are less likely to have the income to buy in. It's taken a longer time. And then that momentum, those momentum factors that I mentioned at the end, I think have resulted in a slow turnover of all white districts. There you go.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask a question of my own for Jim. You mentioned that when you're moved to Southland Park Hills, you punched our ticket into the middle class. And I'd like you to discuss the wealth disparity between people of color and whites that involves home ownership.
You know, Dan has gone over that pretty well. The engine of wealth in this country for middle class people are their homes. In a nice neighborhood, it has increased in value astronomically over the last couple of decades, as anybody who's trying to buy a home in San Francisco, Sacramento, San Diego, those homes are the foundation of wealth for people. And Blacks simply could not purchase that engine at my parents. So as I watch my contemporaries, people my age, baby boomers, inherit their families' homes, which were cottages in Curtis Park or in Land Park or in East Sacramento. Those cottages now cost close to $1 million. And they have that kind of, you know, they have the ability to use that money to buy other things, to send to Harvard, to take care of a sick parent, to any kinds of emergency that you have that costs money and be solved with the equity in your home. And white people have equity that Black people just were unable to get at any price.
Okay, thank you. Kathy Less has a question for Dan. Were there people who were repulsed by the racial covenants who resisted buying in neighborhoods with them?
I can't answer that without speculating. 1944, it's a long time ago, long before my time in Curtis Park. And so we don't have any oral histories that I know of that address it. And it's not the kind of thing that I've seen show up in the newspapers. So we just don't have information on the resistance, as it were.
Another question for you, Dan, from Mary Ellen Burns. Do racial covenants still exist in individual deeds in Curtis Park?
So this is kind of a curious question. There are no, the deeds, the actual documents themselves, were handed to the people who bought the house once they had paid it off. The recording system makes not even a copy, a facsimile, a copy of the details of the deed. It's not like there were Xerox machines when the system began. And so we have a chain of title system in California that's in the recorder's office that has the details about these documents that were in them. And those details are in the recording system. The notes about what was in the deed, including the racial covenants, are in the recording system. That's where I was able to find the documents, is by going to the recording system. It's not the deed itself, it's a record of what the deed was. Now, the California legislature tried to deal with this problem by passing a statute to allow people to put, in effect, a notice in the chain of title saying that they disavowed this, that this was no longer effective, which is only as a historical record of what the documents were that affect these things. you can't wipe it out. It would be destroying a public record. So yes, if you go the chain of title and trace your deed back all the way at the recorder's office, you will see these deed restrictions, or you will find in the chain of title the mutual covenants that were put in the chain of title. It's out damn spot. You can't wipe out history. So they're still around, but there is a procedure that people have taken advantage of because it's expensive and it doesn't actually lead anywhere substantively to record this declaration that such provisions are no longer in effect.
Thank you, Dan. Allison Ledgerwood has a question for Ginger. She says, I was curious if you could talk about your experience as a kid growing up here. Did you perceive the color lines created by neighborhood segregation? Did you notice that some areas of town were very white? And if so, what did you make of it as a kid? Or if not, when and how did you start to become aware of it?
You know, I had to be honest, an idyllic childhood. My mother was active in the PTA, so I had the Girl Scouts, the Brownie Scouts. I had friends and classmates of many colors that I played with. Was I aware I was Black? Exquisitely aware of being Black, and that consciousness is like, I can't remember when not having that consciousness, because when you misbehaved as a child, you were told or you knew that your misbehavior was not just on you and your family, but was a reflection on the Black race. So part of your behavior was about how you were presenting people of color to the other world. I was very much aware of my color, but I don't remember being disliked or resented or hating white people or frankly not having a happy childhood. I had a very happy childhood in Sacramento.
I would like to follow up on that. You have told me, and actually you've written about this, that you were an adult when your mother told you about the discrimination that she faced. Can you elaborate on that?
My mother was everything in the PTA. She was a very active parent. She was the room mother. She was a PTA president, secretary, president, recording, everything. And they would have, in those days, in the 50s, where people were called Mrs. William G. Rutland, Mrs. Timothy. In those days, the ladies would have teas, and they would have teas homes. And Mom recalled one time when one of the people said, Eva, I'm sure you don't want to come, do you? So there were, but mostly people were kind. My mother was a vivacious, well-educated, well-groomed, likable person. And for the most part, the people were gracious to her. And I think it was her. She was a lovely person. And so I don't think that happened very often, but of course it did happen. It did happen.
Okay, thank you. Bruce has a question. Bruce Perini has a question for Dan. And I would like to incorporate my own curiosity into that. It says, curious that Hindus were restricted. Hindu is the only religious group restricted, but they probably meant South Asians, like people from India and Pakistan, who I think were primarily farm workers. Do you think this is so? And I would like to add to that question, none of those restrictions mentioned Latinos. They might have been more overtly called then. So for Dan, that combination question.
So as to the Hindu point, just like Muslim covers a horde of ethnic groups, Hindu was the generic term. What it probably refers to is Sikhs. California has Sikhs in both the north and the south part of the state. who are entrepreneurs and been very successful in small fruits. And they got their start working on the railroads. And so that's who I assume that the Hindu slur was aimed at. As far as Latinx people, I can only speculate that either they were not used at this period of time very extensively in farm work, and certainly had not penetrated into the urban areas to fill the myriad of positions that they fill in our current society. And they were just beneath the notice of the times.
And this is my question for Dan. I guess two parts. The original city of Sacramento is basically inside the freeways today. It seems like that was pretty well in.
Over time, yes. One of the things that happens generationally is as the housing stock deteriorates, it's not as attractive to the people with money. And the upper class money, and those are by and large in the olden days were the white folks, still are largely. And so they were not as interested in living in these areas. And so those areas deteriorate. And then along comes, as I know you know, Dennis, the redevelopment era. In blighted neighborhoods are redeveloped, housing is knocked down, and projects are put in of one kind or another. This happened in the West End. It happened in Highland Park. Deteriorating housing stock became for redevelopment because the land was cheap. And as a result of that, the minorities, and particularly the blacks who lived in those areas, were generally concentrated in Oak Park. Originally, Oak Park had a few blacks. Originally, Sacramento only had a few blacks. It's not until the World Wars that enough of a population of black people moves in to draw the fire, as it were. And that's that's my take on that history for what happens in the central city. The neighborhoods architecturally in the city were not necessarily at all. And I just don't have any information about how racial covenants were employed or if they were employed in the city proper.
Okay, I have a follow-up, I guess, on my question about Mexicans in the deed restrictions. Didi Reyes, this is kind of a comment, and this is again to Dan. There are references to many of the HOLC assessment forms for the cities in California that were redlined. This was part of assessing a neighborhood for inharmonious racial groups. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Actually, Dennis, I think I should bounce that back to you. I think you've done more study of the redlining issue than I have in detail. I think you might be the person to.
All right, I will answer that question. For those of you who don't know, there was an article, September issue of Viewpoint that I wrote that raised the question, why are we so white? And went through the history of it. And one of the things was the Roosevelt administration, in an attempt to stabilize housing during the Depression, and Dan, correct me if I get anything wrong here, created two agencies. One is the Federal Housing Administration, known as FHA, and what Didi refers to, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. They had local real estate people assess neighborhood risk. and this HOLC did. And that map that you saw at the beginning of this presentation, which shows yellow, green, blue, and red areas. And Mary Ellen, is it possible to get that map up now, just for a minute?
That despite all of the things are
So anyway, in hundreds of cities nationwide, real estate assessments were made of neighborhoods. The majority of, in the highest